Ah, great. Sorry, this may be a little awkward at first. I'm in Santiago, Chile, and after a couple of weeks of work here, it's a fairly exhausting couple of weeks, and I hope to share a little bit about that with you. Um, Let me just make sure that my timing is right here. Okay. So we began this conversation last week when I was invited to substitute for the speaker that wasn't able to make it. And we've been going back and forth, interestingly enough, with the title of this talk. And we've had a problem translating the idea of holism, what it means to work with wholes. So that's going to be the theme. And hopefully some kind of an outcome today will be an appreciation of the difference between a reductionist thinking and holistic thinking, and how that's practically applied in the profession of design, architecture, master planning, and landscape architecture. So we've had the discussion of, are we talking about an ecology? Are we talking about global meaning? Are we talking about holistic as terms of holism? And one of the issues that we kept confronting is the idea that if we talk about the earth or healing the earth or working globally, which is the perspective we've gained in the last 30 or 40 years about how the system of life works on the globe, it's almost too, well, it is too big. It's too big to actually work practically. And so what we talk about when we work with large systems is the idea of nested wholes. And let me get to this slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the next, oh, that slide should have been up there. Okay, this slide. So the idea of holons and holarchy, where is the boundary between living things? And let me take a step back. I'm talking about the perspective in this talk about sustainability. And one of the questions I like to ask audiences is, what are we sustaining with sustainability? And we don't have the time to go back and forth with too many questions and answers, but the premise that we hold in our work is that we are sustaining life. We're not sustaining PV panels, we're not just reducing carbon, we're not just reducing toxins in the atmosphere, we're actually sustaining the interactions, complex interactions of all the supporting guilds of living systems that are on the planet. Now, how do we practically work with that? And we maintain that it's actually easier to work with the complexity of life than to engage in a reductionist process of dividing the life into pieces. So let me give you a simple example of that. Our body is a whole. And can you see my, I don't know if you can see, no, I don't have my cursor, won't work here. But if you can see on the slide, you see self, and then family, community, nation, etc. And you also see site, city, watershed, bioregion, earth, and up to the universe. There are no boundaries. There are no real boundaries between the energies and forces of those living objects. And yet we know they are bounded. Bucky Fuller, David McConville referred to yesterday, talked about a system as both bounded and unbounded. Drew a line in the sand with his foot and said, when asked about how to work in complex systems, and the answer is you have to bound a system to work with it. And the paradox is that as he erased that line in the sand, that it's all a figment of your imagination. There are no boundaries, and yet it's bounded. So take the human body as an example. We have, if I wanted to get to know, I'll pick on David McConville, if I wanted to get to know David well, it would not help me to know his liver, kidneys, lungs, heart, and skeletal structure. Well, as interesting as those may be, it doesn't help me to know David. If I put all the parts of David into a pot and stirred them around, I don't get David. So the analogy is similar to how we work typically in cities and our watersheds, that we take some transportation, we take energy, we take social justice, we take waste treatment, we take water systems and stormwater management, and somehow if we glue them all together in pieces, we have a whole. Now, that may work in mechanical systems, but it doesn't work in living systems. Living systems are wholes that are greater than the sums of their parts. So if that's the case, why do we keep dividing them into pieces? And so the nature of wholes are that they are related to each other. And the way we have to work with wholes, getting back to the analogy of David, is I have to get to know a whole being, a whole living entity on his or her or its own terms. And so the only way that I get to know David McConville is by getting to know David, not his heart or his kidneys or liver, by seeing how he is in relationship to other entities, living entities, whether it's a tree or his partner or children or parents or colleagues or even the dog in the street. Those invisible relations tell me more about David than any of the pieces. And those invisible relationships are understood through pattern recognition. And we'll touch on that today. So with that preamble, this is how our perspective, and admittedly, this is our perspective, it's not necessarily the only right way, or is it even entirely correct, but we found that it makes practicable to work with complex systems. So in this context, when we work on projects, my project is not about my project. My project is actually, in terms of sustainability, about supporting the systems of life that are outside of my project, that are the larger whole. So life as a living system actually is understood in terms of nested systems. And let's go to the next slide, please. So let me give you some definitions. This will probably be not easily translated, but let's start with the larger whole. What we say is the greater whole. We use whole to suggest a non-fragmented system, not pieces now. It's a bounded system that the actual system is directly, that we're working in directly influences. So when we use wholes in our practice, we take the Harrison's concept of asking the question, how big is here? Because in terms of sustainability, we are addressing the largest manageable whole that we can address. Hopefully that will come clear with a few examples. The inner whole is your project or the entity you're working with. It could be a campus, it could be a house, it could be a watershed in a city, it could be a park. Now the link between the inner whole and the outer whole is where it gets interesting. And that's known as a value-adding process. What value is the inner whole contributing to the greater whole? And that's a very important concept. We have heard the term a lot these days about net positive. And net positive it sounds wonderful. It actually describes where sustainability needs to go. But anytime there is an abundance or a positive surplus of any material in nature, it is actually a pollutant. I want to say that again. Any surplus that is unable to be used in an ecosystem is a pollutant. And so net positive is not just the way to see it. What we're talking about with value adding is to understand the system well enough so that we know when we are overburdening it or when we are actually not delivering enough. So part of understanding that is actually understanding the patterns of life. Remember, getting back to David, how I understand David, understanding the patterns of life in that place so that we know how it responds to various stimuli. So how does the inner whole support the ability of the outer whole to provide value? And a simple example is value adding goes beyond, you've heard the analogy, instead of giving a man a fish, teach him how to fish. Going to a value-adding premise, you're actually teaching the man how to understand and think about fishing so that when situations change, he can adapt his or her fishing skills. So it's actually thinking about the nature of how they add value to the system. The inner whole works on giving value to the larger whole. Now, one other definition, I know this is entirely inscrutable, but I'm trying to set the stage quickly, is that we have the field of endeavor. And the field of endeavor is what we have to decide what our field of endeavor is. Is it building a project? Is it creating a lead building? Is it creating a sustainable ecosystem? Or is it conserving, like with a park? Or is it sustaining life? We have to decide the purpose of this endeavor. All right, with that in mind now, I actually want us to do a little bit of work. So I would like everybody to uncross your feet, please, just for a moment. Put your feet on the floor. I can see you, so behave now. And just take a minute to image. Now, what does that mean? When we work with complex systems, we cannot really think about them. We actually need to image them. A living system, in fact, any system, is a complex dynamic system, and dynamic is the operative word. How does it operate? And you have to actually run a movie in your head over a period of time to actually see the idea of the system, how it's working, how it's not working. So I'd like you to actually take a moment, and I won't call it meditating, but sit quietly for about 1 minute, one or 2 minutes, and think of a project you are involved in. So get that in your mind right now. I'm going to give it 20 seconds. The project you're involved in that you care to actually address. Think about it. Image about it. All right. I hope you have something in your mind. I want you now to think, what context, what larger system is impacted by your project? I know landscape architects think about this stuff. And so how is your project impacting that larger context? And how is the context impacting your project? Just get that in mind. We're going to have a specific work period about this. Okay. I'm sure you're wondering what is going on. Now, the other question that I want you to think about is, how big is here? How big is the system that you are actually engaged in? Now, what we mean by that is, we know that Montreal is different than Toronto. We know that New York City is different than New Orleans. And we know that there's an invisible boundary, a very fuzzy boundary around all these cities that make it who it is. Not just what it is, but who it is. Your project has an influence on and influence by that larger system. So with that in mind, I want you to get into groups of 3. We're going to try to do this pretty quickly, because this is going to prepare you for the exercise or the workshop that's going to happen after this talk. So please just turn in your seats and get into groups of 3. Make new friends. I see people walking out. They don't want to make new friends. So everybody ready? Get set. Wish I could hear you. All right, everybody ready? Okay, go to the next slide, please. Now, I would like you to take just one of your group's projects. Don't take too much time. And I want the other 2 of you to ask questions to that person about these 3 ideas. I'm sorry I have to speak in English. Define the greater whole of your project. And then, what does this greater whole have the potential to become? What does it actually evolve towards? Because we're talking about life. Life is the process of becoming. Life is the process of evolution. And then, what forces prevent it from realizing that potential? Just see if you can get your head around that. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to work on that. So any major questions? Are you clear enough? If you're not clear, think into it. And if it's totally inscrutable, let me know. It's okay. 5 minutes. All right. Okay, let me ask a question. We don't have a whole lot of time, but let's go to the next slide. So how would your project change if it were working on what is needed by the greater whole? I don't know if I want answers to that because we don't have time, but does that question make sense in terms of just what we've discussed? Is that a general yes? Okay. This is the question that every project has the opportunity to engage in order to actually flash out sustainability in a healing condition on the planet. And it's what I hope you bring it's the question I hope you bring into your workshop afterwards. Now let me explain how this actually works to ground this some. So as Dwight Eisenhower said, if you can't solve a problem, enlarge it. And we certainly have a lot of problems we aren't solving these days. So this is a kind of a quick way to always think to go as large as you possibly can, but that you can manage. We can't just save the earth. We actually can, the whole expression is think globally, act locally. And what is local? Local is how big is here. So how do we work with this and how does it benefit us? So we're down in Chile right now, so we'll use this example. We're working on about a 50-acre, 19-hectare project in Viña del Mar. And we were invited by Sasaki Associates because the client has been working 10 years and realizes that the community hates them. Just doesn't want them, they hate them. Every community activist that we interviewed, every community leader calls this developer, quote unquote, the enemy. And they realized they were in for a 15-year legal battle. And with that 15-year legal battle going up to the Supreme Court to get their development done, they still had no guarantee that they would succeed. So we believe that a living system principle is that all things are reconcilable. So life can very easily be seen as life is an activating force and a restraining force. You want to do a building, you want to do a development, there's always something that's going to restrain it, whether it's budget or NIMBYism or the ecosystem for whatever reason. And yet we do one of two things. We either compromise, which means we lose-lose. I'm the developer and I give up a little, the community gives up a little, and somehow we compromise, we beat each other up enough and we spend a lot of money and we go home and it's a lose-lose situation. That's not a very sustainable situation because every time we compromise, we actually lower the odds for the planet. And then we compromise again, and we drive ourselves into the ground. So compromise is one of these words that we need to get out of the language. The alternative is that we harmonize or reconcile. And the way that works is you don't harmonize or around an existing thought. I don't want this development. I want the development. And then you end up hitting and you get the lawyers out. That is the existence ring. We actually have to move outside of existence into new potential. Some of you who've done the natural step know that if you backcast from the future and find out an image what this system might look like 15 years from now, you can actually get people to think in a different way. By getting people to think of the potential, thanks for the timer, by getting people to think of the different potential, we actually can motivate people to achieve an entirely different viewpoint on the world and on the projects at hand. Now that, if you remember this first slide of both humans that were nested systems of self and family and neighborhood, and then site and community and city, that one, thanks. let's go now to what we are working on is what is at the core of those natures, the nature of place, how big is here, and the nature of the spirit or living system of the community. And what we work in, let's go to the next slide, is before, you keep going, it's the list of belief, philosophies, and principles. Next. Oh, that one. Ha! Did we even go to that slide? I've been talking to the slides on my machine. Okay, that one. Do we need to go back to that other slide for a second? I don't know if I hit that. This is this activating, restraining, and we need to work outside of existence into new potential. How do we win-win? Okay, go to the next slide. So we call this levels of thought. Belief, philosophy, principles, concept, strategies, design. Most every design project that I know begins at the level of concept, strategies, or design. I often find out when I would go for interviews, when I had my architecture firm, that architects would come out of the interviews with models already built. I don't know how they did that. They had never met the client. They may not have ever seen the site, but they built a beautiful building that had no bearing on the site or the community. So what we spend our time on is on belief, philosophy, and principles in order to guide decisions. That's what principles are, guides to action. And so as a result of that, let's go to the next slide. We work with, this is the normal model that this project was working on. The project is a bounded site, and we give gifts to the community. We have transactions to the community, to the neighborhoods, to the ecosystem, to the municipality, to the transportation system, and we do trading, we do trades. That is a slower way to die. That's basically a death by 1,000 cuts. And it is very complex and very hard to manage. Let's go to the next slide. On this project, we shift the boundary to the larger whole of Viña del Mar. And the developer here for the last 10 years has been guarding his project, and it's all about the architecture, it's all about the design, it's all about getting the return on investment. Now remember that activating force, that developer has to have a return on investment, and that becomes a non-negotiable aspect of engaging the community. But other than that, really all bets are open. And so as a result of this reciprocity model, we invite the community in to co-create. The developer is another activist. If you call all these nodes activist nodes, the environment groups, the geology groups, the transportation groups, the water groups, the governance groups, the client, Las Salinas, becomes another activist in that. They become equal and a co-player. And what Las Salinas' role is to convene those people so they actually work together in a coherent whole. Because right now there are 20 different activist groups all competing with each other and all ready to sue the developer. So we met with all the activist groups over the last month and a half, 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks in January, and within those 2 weeks in January, by opening up the dialogue from the project to the nature of the community, we have achieved a 100% turnaround, 180-degree turnaround in attitude. So where all the clients wanted to complain about the nature of the declining quality of development in the city, they were heaping the scorn on this one last parcel, when in reality the city has already been destroyed. Viña del Mar is known as Ciudad Bella, the beautiful city, but it hasn't been beautiful for 30 years. And there's a memory of what Viña del Mar used to be that they want to recover. And so if this development can contribute to the larger whole of Viña del Mar, we actually have a win-win relationship. The development becomes an acupuncture point. So let me give you a quick background. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is Viña del Mar. I wish I had a pointer, but you can see in the left center, the metropolitan region of Valparaiso, Viña del Mar, et cetera. It's a fairly large chunk of the country in terms of population. Thank you. And we did not, our job, let's go to the next slide. Our project was included one of the richest agricultural areas in the country. And let me just make this a little bigger so I can read it. The red dot is our site. And basically, we are working in bounded systems, the inner whole of the site, the larger whole of Viña del Mar, and even the greater whole of the region. Next slide, please. This is the site. It was a tank farm, very polluted, now getting cleaned up. And if you can see in the distance there, you can see the many towers that Viña del Mar has sponsored. At the turn of the century, it was one of the most famous examples of English garden city design. Let's go to the next slide. Here are a few of this is pretty much the beachfront all the way along, a 3-mile stretch. Full of towers. The city has become moved from English gentry houses to a bunch of towers because the politicians wanted to bring economics to the city. As a result of that, it is now a dying city. Tourism is now failing because there's no reason to go there for tourism, and young people are moving away. Let's go to the next slide. So this was Viña, and there are remnants of this garden city, and people all long for it, and yet no one is managing it to achieve it. And this is just one example of the potential of the city. Let's go to the next slide. So you can see the yellow markings, the yellow outline is the site, and it is the terminus of a green way called Libertad that connects that park to the left. And you can see the watersheds, the green watersheds that actually contribute to Viña del Mar. And there's the opportunity right now to bring all that back, but no one knows how. And no one has the will. They're all splintered. They would rather fight each other or fight the development than work together to work on the city. Next slide, please. So if we take that city and engage people in the potential of what it means to work with the larger whole of Viña del Mar as the focus, the developer then becomes a contributor to the quality of life, and the developer also has to be willing to actually learn or co-create with the community. That's a very big risk for most developers, but we find when the developer opens up to be in relationship, the remarkable things happen. We just finished a project in Vancouver, the Lionsgate wastewater treatment plant, and 21 communities, a 100-person design team, and a 50-person department in Metro Vancouver became aligned around something they thought could never be done. And it only took 3 months to do that. And as a result, the project came in 18 months faster than expected, and it was a unanimously approved vote. What is happening now in Viña del Mar is the 20 major activist groups are now, we went from calling this developer to the enemy, not wanting to sit down at the table. One woman, one of the lead activists said, "We are grateful for the opportunity to co-create with you." The developer in turn, and we were very nervous about this week, has acknowledged their role in wanting to be in a reciprocal relationship, not a transactional relationship. And they're incredibly excited about it. So right now we have the beginnings of a relationship, and that's the beginning of life. The definition of life is the process of exchange. And the word development really means, if you look it up, it means the exploration or the understanding and achievement of new potential. Development is a synonym for the word evolution. Let's go to the next slide. So we look at the typical forces and watershed aspects that can contribute to the reestablishing the health of the city. Next slide, just another sample of some of the analysis we've done, and that's nothing new. What is new here, though, is we're not just presenting ideas to the community and expecting them to understand it. We are working with the community to understand their ecosystem. And so what we've been doing is taking these activist members around the community for the last 4 or 5 weeks and helping them fall in love with life again and fall in love with their home again. It's interesting that place or home or community is the one thing that people don't argue about. You can argue about politics, you can argue about religion, you can argue about language, but you don't argue about home. And by engaging people in understanding what makes their home work, what they love about it, we actually find that we can bring people around to be in relationship and to evolve together. And people are incredibly excited about that and moved by it. Let's go back about 6 slides, please, to the ones with the bright blue sky and the office towers. That one. If you can see on the bottom, there is a map of how Viña del Mar has pulsed. It's the fundamental pattern of Viña del Mar. And we don't have time to get into it right now, but Viña del Mar is a city that has continually been born and died, born and died. It's pulsed. And when that is pointed out to people, they recognize that. They tell stories about it. And right now, they're really excited about engaging in a new pulse. We call it compounding resilience. And that word now has become the watchword for this development. How do we, including the developer, including the activists in the communities, take the resources that they're all interested in to compound resilience? The activists now are going to follow their energy and develop their own assignments. And what this developer is doing is actually using his resources to allow the community to become organized more coherently. That's his gift. Their development will change slightly, but they know their primary purpose in this development is to bring back quality of life to the community. This is one of the largest corporations in Chile, and when they described that to me in our initial meetings, I had observed, we basically had observed at a meeting for an hour and a half before that expression, that they had a whole war room of the strengths, weaknesses, the threats from the various activist groups. And when he told me, well, we want to give a gift to the community, the response that I had is, it looks like you're treating them like your enemy. And when he heard that, he actually said, oh my gosh, you're right. And it's just helping people realize that actually they want to be in relationship. And in this case, the developer was actually interested in doing so. That is the rebirth of possibility. The activist communities also want to be in relationship. They actually don't want to keep fighting. But when they have a larger purpose, that larger whole to fight for, it actually gives meaning and vitality to this exercise. So the last slide, please. This work, regenerative development and design, is about the effect we are having on a living system. I'm sorry I have to read this, but it's an important point. It consists of the initiation and continual process of developing an understanding of what is required for healthy relationships between people, people to people, people to living systems. And the real issue is creating the ongoing ability to support, participate, and evolve those relationships. We had a big discussion yesterday with their consultant group on this project, and they said, this means you have to do it forever. This means the developer has to be involved in the community in keeping this momentum going forever. And indeed, that is what they signed up for. And they're very excited about it because that's how they future-proof the quality of life in the community, which then future-proofs their investment. It's a win-win-win-win situation. The ecology, the environment gets healed, the community gets healed, and the developer has a development that actually is part of a healthy and thriving community. So I'll stop there. Thanks.